Hello, this is Lawrence Holgate, the host of Understanding Plato and the author of the textbook Understanding Plato, the Smart Student's Guide to the Socratic Dialogues and the Republic. There are, by the way, now 8 study guides available at Amazon.com. Understanding Plato was the first of this, launched in 2016. This is now episode 14 of our discussion of Understanding Plato. We are now trying to understand the Republic, and we're moving into Book 4 of the Republic. Having finished Book 2, we skipped Book 3, in which Glaucon had objected strongly that Socrates had founded a city-state that was so minimal that he said famously that Socrates, you founded a city that is suitable only for pigs. Glaucon didn't want people to suffer hardship, but he wanted them to recline on proper couches, dine at a table, and have the delicacies and desserts that people have nowadays, telling us a little bit about 4th century BC Athens life, at least for the aristocracy. So in Book 4, Socrates takes up the discussion. He declares that the luxurious city preferred by Glaucon and Adeimantus would now seem to be founded. That is, he's done the work that was needed to tell us what a luxurious city looks like. The city contains 3 distinct classes of individuals, each defined by their innate skills or abilities. Socrates refers to these people as moneymakers or wage earners. There are also auxiliaries, men meaning soldiers, and guardians, meaning rulers. And the largest is the moneymaker or wage-earning class, so-called because it contains farmers, carpenters, craftspersons, merchants, and all other people who create wealth and are the foundations of the city's economy. The next and much smaller class is the group of auxiliaries who protect the city from foreign threats, and the rulers in the domestic execution of the laws. The guardians or rulers are the smallest class in the ideal city-state. If the class of guardians is compromised or comprised of only one person, Socrates uses the word kingship. We know that to mean monarchy these days. If it is comprised of more than one person as the ruler, then the ruling class is referred to as aristocracy, meaning several rulers. In the search for the virtue in the city, in the city that Socrates assumes, first, that our city is indeed, if it has been correctly founded, is completely good. Second, if it is completely good, notice that he declares that it is completely good. He hasn't told us why. But if it is completely good, then it is wise, courageous, temperate, and just. That is, it has all of those virtues. And third, if we find any of these virtues in the city, then what remains will be what we have not found. It is by a process of elimination, Socrates explains, that we will find justice, because it will be the only virtue remaining. And remember now that by the word virtue, Socrates just means excellence. The virtue of something is its excellence. Socrates is once again using an analogical argument, what we also call a species of inductive arguments. The analogies are to a hunter searching for prey or a person looking for a lost object. You'll find this in the Republic at paragraphs 432b to 432d. When Socrates tells Glaucon he feels stupid, it is because justice has been rolling around at our feet from the very beginning. And searching for justice is like those people who hold a lost object in their hands while searching for the very thing they are holding. Now, the problem with this analogy is that it leaves us wondering why Socrates needs to use the elimination method that he has previously described. If justice, like a ball, has been rolling around at his feet while he has been looking for wisdom, courage, and temperance, then surely he could have found justice first. That's at least one objection we might make. Why did he leave it to the last? Second, searching for the definition of a virtue is not at all like searching for a lost physical object. If I'm looking for my car keys and I notice that I'm holding them in my hand, then all that this requires of me is eyesight and a memory of what my keys look like. But if we are to believe the explanation of teaching and learning in the dialogue called Meno, discussed much earlier in this podcast, the search for the definition of justice or any other virtue is like searching for the correct answer to a geometrical problem. It's a matter of recollecting something we already know, and this is often a long process requiring others who know how to ask the right questions to help us recollect what we know but have forgotten. So perhaps a better analogy would be to that of a detective who is looking for an explanation of a murder, how it was committed and by whom. And in order to discover this, the detective might use a process by which he first eliminates a number of hypotheses. For example, that the butler could not have done it because he was out of town that day. However, the detective might still be left with a number of credible explanations, and not be any closer at all to finding what he wants to find, the culprit. Despite the reassurance of Sherlock Holmes in the books written for him, eliminating the impossible does not necessarily lead us to the culprit. Of course, Socrates does not have qualms like this. He's confident that he can find justice by first attaching a definition and a location to each of the other three virtues, and the only definition and location that is left will, necessarily, probably, attach to the virtue of justice. At least that looks like it's his tactic. Find the other three virtues, and then you'll be left with justice, which is the only virtue left, and there you are. Well, the question is whether we can search for a definition in the same way we search sometimes for a lost physical object. I'm going to give you a breakdown of the argument that Plato gives in Republic 427 to 433. Assume that we are dealing with the virtue of wisdom, the virtue of courage, the virtue of moderation, and the virtue of justice. And assume also that the city described, the luxurious city, has these good-making characteristics. For example, they have a knowledge of guardianship, of how the city is to be ruled. They have the power to preserve the correct belief about what it is to be feared and what is not to be feared. That goes with courage, by the way. They have an agreement between the naturally worse and the naturally better as to which of the two is to rule the city, kind of a contract between those persons who might see themselves as naturally worse and those who might see themselves as naturally better. I'd be surprised if anyone ever got to that point, as to which of the two is to rule in the city. And finally, everyone in the city is doing only the work for which he or she is naturally best suited. That should be familiar, by the way, by now. Everyone in the city is doing only the work for which he or she is naturally best suited. And when we look for wisdom in the city, Socrates says we will find knowledge. We will find that virtue in the knowledge of kingship. When we look for courage in the city, we're going to find it in the power of people to preserve the correct belief about what is to be feared and what is not to be feared. That would surely be the soldier class. And when we look for moderation in the city, we will find agreements between everyone, especially between the naturally worse and the naturally better, as which of these two is to rule in the city. Well, all that's left now is justice. Socrates really thinks that he's found the other virtues. Now the only one left is justice. And that is, and here's a drum roll, that must be the good-making characteristic that he earlier talked about, where everyone in the city is doing only the work for which he or she is naturally best suited. It's the only characteristic that is left. He's already pinned down the other three. So Socrates declares the virtue of justice in the city must be that which is left, namely, everyone in the city is practicing one of the occupations in the city for which he or she is naturally best suited. There you have it. That's justice in the luxurious city. Now, I'm sure that readers have noticed by now that saying that justice is the practice of everyone doing what he or she is naturally suited to do, is identical to what we earlier called in Book 2 the principle of natural division of labor. That was one of the principles, in fact, which Socrates used to explain the origin of the city. The argument can be summed up in one sentence. Justice in the city is now defined as everyone in the city doing the one task for which he or she is naturally suited because the city has its origin in this distribution of work. The original city, if you recall, the non-luxurious city, started out with just 3 or 4 groups of people who decided that the only way they were going to get along was to do the task for which they are naturally suited. But the argument is unsound, surely. The conclusion that justice is everyone doing what they're naturally suited to do just begs the question, how did that principle, everyone must do what he or she is suited to do, how did that principle get on the list in the first place? And what other good-making characteristics of cities are there that did not get on the list? We had the 4 that we've just talked about, including justice. Justice was the last one. But why not others? Now, if we answer the first question by saying, well, because the principle of natural division of labor is the definition of justice, then the argument is now circular. We're just coming around and engaging our premise again. If we answer the second question, what other good-making characteristic of cities are there that did not get on the list? If we answer that question by citing several other types of good-making characteristics, and we end up discarding them and arguing for the principle of natural division of labor, then this is something we could have done in the first place. Why do we have to go through all this falderall in order to get to this definition of justice? Why didn't he just say it instead of pretending that he had found it in the same way that you might find a ball or your keys? Socrates seems to be aware, and here I should say Plato, who's writing the book called Republic, his character Socrates, seems to be aware that he needs more than this argument to convince us that justice in the city is adherence to the rule that each person must practice one of the pursuits in the city, the one for which he or she is naturally suited. He backs this up with another argument that appeals to what, quote, we have heard many people say. And he says, when you do this, when you take a survey of these people, they will say that justice is doing one's own work and not meddling with what is not one's own. Now, what's interesting about this is that Socrates here credits what other people say about justice after previously scolding Crito for listening to what the majority would say about justice and injustice. Remember in the dialogue Crito that we discussed quite some time ago, that Socrates was very dismissive of what other people would say about moral matters. And here he is, though, crediting what other people would say about his definition. For all we know, what people say should have no bearing on the question about justice and injustice until we hear their reasons for saying this. Now, second, Socrates draws an analogy between justice in the city and justice in the settlement of lawsuits. In the settlement of lawsuits, the judges will have no aim in judging other than this, quote, no citizen should have what is another's or be deprived of what is his own. Paragraph 433c. Justice in the city is similar to courtroom justice, in that justice in the city is also a kind of owning. For example, doing one's own work, the work for which he or she is naturally suited. Well, is this analogy going to work? Think about it. Like all analogies, this one must also stand or fall on the basis of relevant similarities. That's when you want to test an analogy that someone proffers, look at whether the similarities they give between the two things are really relevant, and are there enough of them? If one person A sues another person B over a dispute about ownership of a house, and A wins the suit, A can declare that justice has been done. I have not been deprived of what is my own, he would say. But when one is assigned the job of carpenter, because she is naturally suited to do this type of work. She would not say that she owns the work in the same way that she owns a house or a hammer. She cannot sell or give away her work, and no one can steal or damage it. She might lose her job if she does bad work. Somebody could hire her to do work, but you could not bring a lawsuit against the city on the ground that the city has stolen her job, although she might argue that she has been unjustly dismissed from the job because she has met the requisite performance standards. Now, if this is all that Socrates means by the analogy to justice in a civil court, we can accept it, but it's hard to see how it gives us support to the argument that justice in the city is for everyone to do the work that they are suited to do. Socrates then turns to the topic of injustice in the city and quickly convinces Glaucon that it is a meddling and exchange of the three classes in the city in which the moneymaker or wage earner tries to take the role of the soldier, or a soldier who is unworthy tries to enter the class of judges and guardians, or when one person tries to do all three tasks at once. And Socrates says here that that event would be the greatest harm that can happen to a city and would rightly be called the worst evil one could do to it. This is injustice, and it's the opposite of justice. Quote, when the money-making, auxiliary, and guardian class each do their own work in the city. So we're going to close off our discussion of chapter 4 of the dialogue, the search for justice in the city. I've been reading out of chapter 8 in the book, and I have gotten up to page 100. For those of you who have the book, we're going to start out then in the middle of page 100 in chapter 8.2, if you will. And I suspect that this dialogue is going to take us 3 different episodes. So this is episode 1, featuring book 4 of Plato's Republic. Signing off, and I hope you listen in the next episode. Good evening.